Okay, everybody, I want everybody to listen because it's story time on the farm from behind Barnway. I want everybody to settle down, relax, take some deep breaths, open your ears. Know that you are safe and sound here as the Good Shepherd reads to you an afternoon story about what should be becoming at this point, with the last chapter of this book, your story, your new story, your renamed story. Today I'm reading the final chapter, chapter 12 of the book called To Be Told by Dan B. Allender. God invites you to co-author your future. I didn't even know this was the final chapter until just now. I've so loved doing these audio book recordings because I'm actually finishing books. You know, in life, a lot of people like to say things like, oh, well, I have ADHD or distractions and all of that. And those are nice excuses or whatever you want to call them. I choose to find different ways to not handle life, rather to appreciate, enjoy, and value life. And to me, reading is very important, and yet life itself is important. So I'm always getting carried away, taken away. And this has been a beautiful way for me to actually read now 2 books in a row. I'm finishing up my second audio recording. Chapter 12, Giving Away Your Story. A gift isn't fully realized until it is given away. We therefore submit ourselves to the labor of becoming like the gift. To have painted a painting does not empty the vessel out of which the paintings come. On the contrary, it is the talent which is not in use that is lost or atrophies, and to bestow one of our creations is the surest way to invoke the next. Lewis Hyde. I never knew space held stories until I left my first counseling practice to move west. The office furniture had been carried away by the movers, and I was going to vacuum the carpet and pick up the debris that a decade had left. I walked into the room and felt a wave of sorrow that I hadn't anticipated. What happened next is hard to describe. I closed the door and sat in the middle of the room, and stories came out of the walls to dance, and then to be put to rest. It was the last day before my family and I were to leave, and there were countless errands and tasks to complete, but I couldn't move. I sat in the middle of the room for nearly 2 hours. I suspect if someone had walked in, that person would have presumed I'd had a psychotic break. I wept and I laughed. I sat quietly and was carried along on a journey that felt like the midnight travels of Scrooge. I'd simply been minding my own business, but in a flash I was whisked away to see my life. Life-changing conversations had occurred in that room. God had at times used me to birth heartache into the beauty of hope. More often than not, the people I was supposed to help brought me stories that transformed my heart. I was birthed in that office, and I will never be able to repay those men and women. Stories inevitably haunt and guide us. They indebted us. Whom do you owe? You owe someone, at the very least your mother and father, but most of us owe someone who has birthed us to become who we are. I owe my life to Ray Dillard. Dr. Ray Dillard was an associate professor of Old Testament at the seminary I attended. He taught me that a person can live a wild and edgy life, speak with passion about the Bible, and be deeply honest about one's failures of love. He taught me earthly holiness. On a trip to Israel, I was one of 20 of Dr. Dillard's students waiting for a plane in Geneva. I had finagled a row of seats in the airport lounge so I could lie down. My head was up against a table that held 10 empty beer bottles, and I was smoking a fine Cuban cigar. Dr. Dillard snapped a picture of me and sat down on the edge of one of the seats. He leaned forward and said, "Whatever you do in this life for God, don't forget that you are undeserving of such luxurious grace." His mischievous smile and twinkling eyes took in the scene and branded my soul with his joy. It should not be a great surprise that for me, God's face looks remarkably like Dr. Dillard's. I could never repay my debt to him, in part because he was a hilarious giver, the kind of giver Paul commended in 2 Corinthians 8. There he talked about the Macedonian church that gave with joy. The Greek word for joy is the root of our word hilarity. Paul's message was, give not because you must, but because you can. Give, not counting the money going out, but give with abandon and laughter. You need $100? Well, here's $500. Dr. Dillard lived in the odd ebb and flow of heartache and hope. and he gave the gift of infectious hilarity to many. What made him even more extraordinary is that he didn't indebt me to himself, but he did indebt me to teach the Bible with depth, passion, and joy. He called for my debt to him to be paid to others. Paul did the same many years ago. In the book of Philemon, one of the most fascinating but seldom read letters of the New Testament, Paul wrote to a slave owner. Philemon's slave, Onesimus, I don't know how to pronounce these words, I'm so sorry, had come to know Jesus through Paul's ministry, and Onesimus had served Paul in a Roman jail. Paul wrote a letter and gave it to Onesimus to take to his owner. The letter was intended to mend the breach between slave owner and runaway slave. What makes this story fascinating is that Paul had also been the one used of God to bring the slave owner Philemon into a relationship with Jesus Christ. Philemon and Onesimus were now family. Here's how Paul put it. So if you consider me your partner, give him the same welcome you would give me if I were coming. If he has harmed you in any way or stolen anything from you, charge me for it. I, Paul, write this in my own handwriting. I will repay it, and I won't mention that you owe me your very soul. The plot thickened. In a book that is shorter than most chapters found in his other epistles, I don't know how to pronounce these words, I really do apologize, and this is the last chapter, but let's carry forward, okay? Paul demolished the foundation of slavery and any other totalitarian regime. He ripped the heart of slavery out of its body without addressing a single word against the evil institution. Instead, he presumed that a new bond of story will not only alter a single relationship, but will also in time destroy the narrative of slavery. Paul banked on past stories, specifically the story of how God had used him in Philemon's life. That story was the backdrop of a new story, the saving of Onesimus. One story of redemption links to the next, and over time all stories of redemption come to have a common center. The storyline may differ, but the result is the same: transformation. And stories that transform us make us bold. Paul is an example. If Onesimus owed Philemon a debt, Paul pointed out that he himself would gladly repay it. He wrote this in his own wobbly, almost unreadable hand, and then he reminded Philemon, and I won't mention that you owe me your very soul. It's hilarious. What he said he wouldn't mention, he named with brazen boldness. It is one of the most unbelievably manipulative statements I've ever read. What makes Paul's wiles so endearing, though, is that the benefit is not for his own gain. Consider the enormity of Paul's message. I'm sending this runaway slave back to you. He has most certainly cost you something in his absence, and you might think that Onesimus should forfeit his life so that you might have an example for other slaves who might consider running away. But then Paul said, if you need to kill him or beat him, take my life or rip into my flesh instead. And by the way, speaking of lives, I want to remind you that you owe me your very soul. But whatever you do, do so with freedom and joy. This is hilarious giving. What if we were to embrace with wonder every person who has spoken our name and written our story, either to glory in God or to horror in hell? In truth, we are as indebted to those who hated us and did us harm as we are to those who have gifted us with a faint reminder of God. I am a debtor to those who sexually abused me because they aroused in me fury and defiance against injustice. For that, I am eternally grateful. I don't bless their harm, but I do thank God for how He has chosen to use that harm to mold me to live my story. This is beautiful. Every story that we receive as a gift indebts us to enter the teller's story for good. If I listen to your endless tales of vacationing in the Cancun, then I expect you to listen to my road woes. And how much more indebted am I when your engagement with my story transforms my life? So we are to hold each other's stories. When we remember a friend's birthday, we are putting our arms around an event and calling that person's life good. If we go beyond holding to entering the story in order to explore and suffer its fullness, then we have the privilege of helping to write and edit the other person's story for the sake of its potential to reveal God. We must therefore give one another storytelling opportunities in order to create the debt of care. Jesus himself tells a story to compel us to invest in stories. He taught that we are to use all that we have to make friends. Buy a sailboat if you want, but make sure you use it to gain access to other lives and new stories. Want to hang out in a particular coffee shop? Great! Just do so for something more than mere caffeine. As we live our story, we are to give away our talents, time, and wealth, to indebt others not to ourselves, but to the God who writes great stories. We are to use our money wisely and winsomely to invest in gaining access to stories that can transform others and ourselves. Obviously, this activity is different than paying a person in some form to be our friend. By definition, that is entering into a form of prostitution. Neither is this activity buying access to people in order to get one's daughter into Harvard. To tell stories to impress or intimidate is to entrap. The opposite of telling stories, to set others free. A gift-giving, liberating story tells of innocence lost, tragedy encountered, imagination employed, and the brief and glorious moments of an ending that reminds us again that our story is not finally written by us, but we co-author it with God. The gift of this kind of story is the deep and fundamental reminder that we are not our own. We are God's. We invest in another when we see ourselves as uniquely privileged and available to join his or her story. Gabrielle Marcel speaks of availability as a being who is ready for anything, the opposite of him who is occupied or cluttered up with himself. Not to be cluttered with oneself means that we have first embraced our life as God's story, whether we understand or even like what he has written. Further, not to be cluttered with oneself is to embrace enough of our story to say to God and to others, he is good, and he has written me well. And perhaps even more, being uncluttered calls me to wrestle with those stories that confuse me, the stories I continue to hold at arm's length. We will never be fully at ease with our story, but we can come to love our story profoundly and with more joy. Finally, to be uncluttered is to offer all of who we are, even the parts that are still unredeemed, for the redemption of others. And as we give our story for another's redemption, more often than not, the story will eventually return to us a new gift. What we give away often returns with greater goodness than what we originally gave. The true debt is, of course, never paid solely to the one who first received and embraced our story. We will hopefully return to that person the same care and more, but still our debt is too small if it is only returned to the one who first received us. Instead, the debt is paid forward. As I hold and dance with your story, my life will be transformed and I will have a new story to offer others. Sharing stories is a feast of plenty that increases with each sitting. There is always more story to tell, hear, write, and enjoy. The better our story is read and enjoyed, the more we're called forth to live our story for God's glory, the more we will offer the same to others. We can repay our debt to God only by loving the story he has written in each of our lives. Such a debt summons us to invest in story, in our own story, and in the stories of others. Next came the servant who had received the 2 bags of gold with the report. "Sir, you gave me 2 bags of gold to invest, and I have doubled the amount." The master said, "Well done, my good and faithful servant. You have been faithful in handling this small amount, so now I will give you many more responsibilities. Let's celebrate together." Then the servant with the 1 bag of gold came and said, "Sir, I know you are a hard man, harvesting crops you didn't plant and gathering crops you didn't cultivate. I was afraid I would lose your money, so I hid it in the earth, and here it is." But the master replied, "You wicked and lazy servant, you think I'm a hard man? Do you? Harvesting crops I didn't plant and gathering crops I didn't cultivate? Well, you should at least have put my money into the bank so I could have some interest. Take the money from this servant and give it to the one with the 10 bags of gold." The owner of the vineyard decided to take a long and most likely very luxurious trip, and before leaving, he put some of his investments into the hands of his trusted servants. He chose to divide the investments into unequal amounts with no explanation. Then he departed with no announcement about when he would return. Do you see God here? God is often absent. He promises to return at his very leisure. He divides gifts, talents, and stories unequally, and he expects everyone to risk and multiply what he gave. He will one day hold us accountable for how we invest ourselves in his story. The parable is sobering. It boils down to use it or lose it. Grow or you will die. There is no neutrality with God or with life. If your goal is to conserve your wealth and remain safe, then inflation, the economic equivalent to entropy, will eat away at your principle. Risk is inevitable. Safety is impossible. The safer you wish to be, the more likely it is that you will die like a deer in the blinding headlights of the approaching God. We don't really believe this to be true because we see so many people who seem to be living safe and predictable, if somewhat dull lives. Why can't we keep the safety and alive just a little closer to the edge? Live just a little closer to the edge while also whittling away significant clumps of monotony. Isn't that a fair compromise? But we can't make that Faustian bargain because God has rigged the world. If we're willing to give up all forms of danger and all chances for thrill, then we can keep a worthless safety. The moment, however, that we edge toward passion in any hobby, task, or relationship, then we've set in motion an irreversible momentum toward God. Passion is always a slippery slope to God that only burrowing into boredom can stop. In Jesus' parable, one servant chose preservation over risk. He knew the vineyard owner to be highly eccentric, unpredictable, and difficult. Again, what a picture of God. So that servant played it safe by burying his story. He hid it because he knew that if he didn't make good use of it, there would be a price to pay. He couldn't have been more correct while being more desperately wrong. The vineyard owner didn't require success. He called for wisdom, risk, and tenacity. If this servant had invested and lost, there would be consequences, but not without engagement and deliberation. How do I know? Because the answer is in the story. The owner wasn't looking for a financial windfall. He would have settled for 1.5% interest earned on the simplest passbook savings account. He just wanted the servant to risk the bag of gold he'd been given. We're all given gold in the form of our body, face, name, and story. Some of us are gorgeous and brilliant, while others are ordinary. Truly, what does it matter? We are simply called to use our gifts to plant the fields and gather the crops that are under our stewardship. What does this mean with regard to the gift of our story? To humbly embrace our story, face, and name means to confess the following. We are God's story, which means we expertly are written. We are called to write our story with God in order to bring Him more glory. We write our story best by giving our heart away to others whom we honor as more important than ourselves. What we give to others is a unique story, a theme that reveals God like no other story can. We discover our unique calling and story as we allow others to read us, which happens as we give ourselves away for their good. We reveal God best in relationships when we join with God to write and edit one another's story for God's glory. Each of our stories is part of the gospel, the greatest story. The gospel is our story and the beginning and end of all that we write. We are summoned by God to seed this earth with our stories, and we are to harvest the fruit that comes from our labor. Our bags of gold give us power and place. No matter our proportion of gold or which realm of conversation it puts us in, we are to be involved in the same story. Grow beauty, pluck weeds, and bring the bounty to God as we celebrate His glory with Him. We must know how much money is in our bag so we can name our giftedness. Most of us balk at such a requirement, either fearing a big head or, more honestly, the weight of glory. To confess that we are possessed of certain gifts requires us to use them. And inevitably, when we use our gifts, we provoke envy or encounter greater hardship. Again, it is the way God has rigged the world. Since our stories reveal God, no story is ours alone. All our stories are owned by God and reveal truth. Therefore, no one has the right to say of his story, "This is too weird, painful, boring, shameful, confusing, or dark. Therefore, I will bury it." All our stories are meant to be available for the purpose of revealing God and connecting us to one another. Love it. But our story does not need to be told to everyone, even the most intimate friends. We are to be guardians of our story, and it is to be given as a gift, not wantonly, but carefully. It is a gift to be given only to the right person at the right time for the right reason. Let me offer an example. My wife and I were talking about how we would use an unexpected income tax refund. She wanted to have some cosmetic dental work done. I balked. It seemed like a lot of money to spend on something no one could really see, and then she told me a story. I won't tell it to you since it's personal. The story had to do with moments of significant shame when my wife was student teaching. She told me the story, and I wept. My lovely and kind wife was humiliated by a group of girls, and I wanted them to pay for their cruelty. Yet prior to hearing the story, I wasn't willing to pay a few $100s to alter something that had caused my wife shame. Clearly, stories have the power to transform our heart. I agreed to the dental work, and I then asked, "Why haven't you told me this story before?" She said, "It took me 22 years to trust you with that story." I felt both sorrow and honor. Why had it taken me so many years to gain her trust? And what had transpired over that season in our life to assure her that I would hold her story with care? We will never know all the stories of those closest to us. You can work with colleagues for 20 years and seldom know even the most rudimentary stories of how they came today. Nevertheless, every story given to us and every story told to another is a precious gift that has the potential to seed us with God. The story I'm about to tell is actually 4 stories moving in separate yet overlapping symmetry. It is complex like all stories, and yet it straightforwardly communicates the truth that the gift of story inevitably takes us to the story of God's gift. I sat with a dear friend talking about her daughter. The two of us commiserate often about the joys and sorrows of raising and being raised by teenage daughters. In this particular conversation, my friend told me about an art project that marked her daughter. She took a series of photographs of her body and superimposed them over a picture of a cross that she had carved into her arm. The knife wound was superficial but real. It was a mark of violence, and it reflected her deep war with both her body and her faith. As a parent and a friend, I was horrified. Teenage cutting is on the rise, and I felt nausea and fear as I reflected on how I'd feel if she were my daughter. The art she created was over the edge. Most would consider the art sick. But I know the young woman, and I know her war will not be in vain. Her story may appear to be dark, but I know her heart bears a light and life that many more conventional lives have long ago lost. I can't wait to see where the marks of passion takes her story. But her mother, my friend, was undone by this. The work of art was beautiful. It is part of her daughter's deep wrestling with the God who has arisen in the darkness of life to fight for her name and calling. The girl's mother loved the art. She hated the agony. What risk is worth taking to create a new way of seeing life? Art, like life, ought not be dangerous or cost us our blood, we presume. But is this true? As I tried to comprehend the meaning of her daughter's blood, I told my friend that it reminded me of my favorite novel, Chaim Podok's My Name is Asher Lev. She gasped. That is her daughter's favorite novel. The novel tells of a Jewish artist, an exile to his religiously conservative friends and family because he chose to be an artist rather than a rabbi. The novel moves to Asher Lev's even greater crime of using the cross of Jesus in one of his paintings because he feels that it expresses the depths of his family's pain. Asher Lev violates his faith and takes a risk with his art that puts him beyond the pale of his family and faith in order to enter more deeply into his faith. No one else in his community can comprehend, let alone commend, his choice. My friend's daughter, who was away at college, had asked her mom to bring along that novel on the day she showed her mother her art. One story, that of Asher Lev, broke open a conversation about another story, a daughter's dangerous art. This conversation allowed my friend to wrestle with her daughter's choice and invited her to consider afresh her daughter's dangerous creation. I felt honored to have been part of a moment of revelation. I had offered part of my wealth, and it had already begun to bring dividends. Before I left, I asked my friend how she felt about a meeting we'd had with another friend. She said, "It was so enjoyable to see you two so playful and apparently having so much fun." I smiled because I had likewise experienced the time as mischievous and lighthearted. Then she added, "It was as if you were two boys playing together in a stream." My head snapped back as if I had been rear-ended in a highway accident. "What did you say?" She repeated her observation, and I started to turn cold. The phrase unlocked a story I'd never shared with her. The story involves playing with a friend alongside a stream when I was a child. My friend had crossed over the stream while I stayed on the other side. We walked on opposite sides until the water got too deep for me to cross over to his side. Soon, 2 older boys came out of the woods and began to hassle my friend. He called for me to come to his aid, and I froze. The older boys eventually beat my friend to a pulp as I stood apart, too frightened to go to his assistance. It was one of the most cowardly acts of my life, and the image of playing at a stream with another boy threw me into panic. I had to leave the conversation due to another appointment, but I felt story-haunted. As I experienced that day, if we are involved in a community of stories, then one story will eventually bump into and awaken another story. An awakened story that is properly cared for will take an individual, a relationship, a community, in directions no one can predict. Investment in one another's stories brings wild dividends. For days, I pondered this image of 2 boys playing together in a stream. I don't know its full meaning. I only know what God invited me to write. Here is part of a journal entry. When my friend spoke about the stream, I froze. I could hear the cries of my boyhood friend, and I knew if I crossed, I'd be mauled. If I ran, I'd never be able to face him again. If I entered his persecution, I'd be pummeled. I witnessed the crime and refused to join his suffering. How often has that been my failure of fidelity in other friendships? Since then, I will fight nearly to the death if a friend is assaulted, but am I willing to be a boy again and ask a friend to go play? I may be loyal now in a way I was not back then, but do I invite anyone to sit with me in the horror of that choice? Wow. I don't know all that was exposed in my friend's simple remarks, but I do know it is a story that waits for redemption. It is a story that compels me to ask, will I play with anyone again? I suppose what I'm most undone by is the interplay of stories. How did Asher Lev come to mind? And am I to hear in his arrival a call to the dangerous, faith-risking creativity of playing again with a new friend by a stream? If so, I am both intrigued and infuriated by this web of stories. I am again asked not only to be a child, but to ask for a father who can protect me and my friends from bullies and who can help me sort through my legion of fears. Again, I am caught. An investment in another person's story will always return to us like a boomerang, whacking us on the back of the head. The awakening whack helps us see that we move on the margin of reality like a sleepwalker. The more awake we become, the more we can play in the story we are called to write for others, and that others are called to write on our behalf. Will I receive from the wounded hands my day's portion of story? And will I bring my tears and battered questions for him to engage? Will I bring my story to the gospel and cry out for him to answer? And will I offer my broken story as a gift to others to taste and see that God is both odd and good? If I will do this, then the gift that I receive will stagger me. God's story will be my own. Your story will be mine. Mine will be yours. And we all will be his. Your stories are meant to be given away to others for their benefit, and the stories of others are meant for your benefit. What stories told to you have impacted you the most? What characteristics of God do you see revealed through the stories of others? What have you learned about yourself in the process of writing your stories and telling them in community? And there we have it. We've just finished To Be Told by Dan B. Allender. God invites you to co-author your future. All of these videos that I've been uploading to my social media, on my YouTube, my TikTok, my Facebook, I do have playlists on each of my profile pages, and so you can find all of these chapter by chapter audio book recordings listed under my playlists titled To Be Told. Thank you for joining in. I have so many other books to choose from, and it's really beautiful because I'm not here to choose. I'm here to be led to rather delight in whatever book will be next for me to jump into.